Any views or opinions expressed on KUR are not necessarily those of Kutztown University, Kutztown University Student Government, Kutztown University Student Services Incorporated, KUR staff and management, or other affiliated organizations.
Tough topics. Discussing those issues that are important to the KU campus community that might not be getting talked about enough. And now, your host, tackling those tough topics, Trisha, on the radio voice, KUR.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to Tough Topics. Once again, we're in the month of March, and it's actually pretty warm outside today, so that's really exciting. I'm your host, Trisha, and today with me I have Maya, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey y'all, I'm Maya. On campus here, I'm the Vice President of the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, and I also work with Trisha in the Women's Center. So I'm really excited to be joining Trisha today and to get into our discussion.
It's going to be an interesting discussion. It's going to be one that I typically don't really actually talk about quite often. I don't necessarily avoid this topic, but it can get kind of exhausting to talk about. So March is Women's History Month, and so that kind of inspired my topic this month. So we're going to talk a little bit about voting, because this year is also the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, because there's some things that we don't necessarily really consider with that either. And then we're going to talk a little bit about women in government and women in politics. But I want to kind of start out with, why is this another topic that, is tough to talk about, or why don't we talk about it, or why is this important? And so I'm going to throw out some facts and statistics of why this is important and why we should focus on this, especially during Women's History Month. And it's that women lead only 14 of 195 countries, and women are paid 23% less globally, and that only 7% of the Fortune 500 companies are run by women. So over globally, throughout all different nations and countries, we are just seeing a huge lack of representation of women within, every single space. I think in the past couple of years, we've definitely done a lot to change that and to work a little bit harder to see more representation. But, today we are still seeing not a lot of representation. So yeah, it'll be an interesting topic to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited to get started.
So let's go back really far, about 100 years. And let's talk about how we, gained the right to vote. But most people don't realize that at that time, it was white women that gained the right to vote. That women of color actually really struggled still to have the same access and same rights in terms of politics and things like that. And they were largely excluded from the suffrage movement, really, and generally as well. So it's an interesting part that I don't think we tend to talk about when we talk about women's history. So
yeah, I think we kind of regard these suffragettes and kind of see them as very important, and they were. And however, we kind of fail to realize, like Trisha was saying, that very few of them were actually abolitionists or well-rounded advocates. They just kind of cared about their own personal right to vote, these white women, and they didn't really consider the full picture or the full spectrum. One figure that I think is really important from this era is Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth spoke at the 1851 Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. And she did her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" A lot of people have to read it in high school. I read it actually for the first time in full last year, and it really changed the way that I saw a lot of things. In her speech, she spoke about the unique oppression of Black women, which is something that we talk a lot about intersectionality now. Intersectionality being how different factors that make up who you are can kind of lift or oppress you in society, and how you see the world and how other people see you. But Sojourner Truth was kind of talking about this, since the 1850s. Like, that's a really long time ago. It didn't really come into our dialogue until like the 90s. So the unique oppression of Black women. And I think that her speech wasn't really supported by a lot of the white women suffragettes, because they were still really focused on their own self-interest.
Interestingly, the one thing that I actually didn't really know was during the one march, they were like, women of color have to be in the back. And it's like, what? Like, I'm sorry. You, as a woman, know what it's like to be discriminated against.
Right.
And yet we still, like, at that time, we're like, okay, so, like, only this set of white women can have rights and, like, can be a part of our group and be a part of our club. Everyone else has to be in the back.
Right.
Which I think actually, if you really think about it, that sets the tone for the way the rest of the feminist movements really went.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we, I think, saw, some of those waves being predominantly white and, not really having a lot of space at the table for women of color.
Right. And it's like going through all the movements of feminism. Each movement got a little bit more accepting, but we still see time and time again that certain groups are left out of the discussion. Like, even now, there's trans exclusionary radical feminists who, aren't people that we consider to be part of the feminist movement, but they're still out there, and they still try to push aside an entire group of people that deserves our support and deserve to be talked about. So yeah, I feel like this, like Trisha just said, this really set the tone, the fact that they didn't include these women of color in their protests and their discussions. They tried to ignore their existence.
Oh, 100%. And some of the research that I was doing on this, I found that, Native Americans and Asian immigrants were largely excluded from even just citizenship. Like, right. So we're seeing other populations that just weren't even allowed to have any rights here in the United States. And that's kind of important. It's not necessarily the focus of our topic today, but it's always important to throw some of that stuff back out there. One of the things, this is a quote from Robin Muncie. She's a historian at the University of Maryland that I thought really was a great way to summarize what's happening, or, how to really just summarize all of that, is it's important to remember how piecemeal a struggle it was. You're seeing change as coming in one fell swoop undermines us as citizens and gives us a false idea about the way change happens. So, like, we really glamorized this idea that, 100 years ago, like, we got the right to vote. But there was still a lot of work to be done after that. And it really gives you, like she said, like a false idea of how change happens, because change doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't, come just from one part, like one side and one color or one ethnicity or one anything. It has to be a collaboration. It has to be a group effort.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Interestingly, the one thing I think we can still see and talk about that is very relevant to today is voter suppression. And this is not something that I've even really thought about, because I have privilege, and as a white woman, I have privilege. I get to enter spaces that not everybody is fully supported in. And, until really recently, I've never thought about being suppressed in my right to vote. And there's still states that are implementing new restrictions on voting. And that's really frustrating, because voting, and we kind of talked about this a little bit before we even before we decided on this show, was that, voting shouldn't be hard.
Right.
being able to check where your polling place is shouldn't be hard. You should be able to just like know what site to go to or where to check or things like that. Even registering to vote shouldn't be such a process. Like having an absentee ballot shouldn't be such a process. And that's frustrating that, you know, as someone that is white and has power and privilege, I'm sitting here like, it shouldn't be this hard. And so I can only imagine what it's like for people of color to sit here and be like, well, I can't even access my polling place because it's X amount of miles away and I don't have a license and I don't have an ID and I don't have all these different things that ultimately are barriers to voting.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other interesting thing about voter suppression is it's such a real thing right now. And I think when I was originally reading about it, I kind of considered it as, oh, that happened a while ago. That was Jim Crow laws. That was a long time ago. But these issues still very much exist today and they need to be talked about. And yeah, so like Trisha was saying, these things need to be accessible to everyone and not just for some people or some people that have the in or no.
You made just a fantastic point about how these issues feel like past issues.
Right.
These issues feel like, you know, years ago, like that's not now. We're in 2020, like it should be so much easier and, you know, equality and like all these, it's so easy to like be like, and I think it's because the people that are progressing are progressing. And it's hard to slow down when the rest of the society is not progressing as quickly as, you know, maybe even a group of people are. I think I have that thought very often, actually, when I think about our whole, administration. I'm always stunned and left feeling like, how did we get here? How are we still in a place that is setting us back so far again? And we're just going to have to redo all this work in the next 4 years if we get someone else in office.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of my general board members from the FMLA, Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, we were having a discussion about how they went to the original Women's March and they made all these signs and then they pulled their signs out again and all of the signs were still applicable. Like nothing really changed. There wasn't anything that they could say, oh, we checked that off the list in the last couple of years. Like we overcame that. It's like everything that existed still existed. So I definitely find that with the topic of voter suppression and a lot of the things we're going to keep discussing over the next couple minutes.
It's just so frustrating. So for anyone that's possibly listening that may not really know much about voter suppression or what that really looks like, there are certain new restrictions on voting. Since the 2010 elections, 24 states have implemented new restrictions on voting. Alabama now requires a photo ID to cast a ballot. Other states, such as Ohio and Georgia, have enacted the use it or lose it laws, which strike voters from registration rolls if they have not participated in an election within a prescribed amount of time. That is ridiculous. You know, there's this overwhelming sense of I feel like there is a large population that feels like my vote doesn't matter, so I'm not going to vote.
Right.
So how long does that, like, if that's lasting year after year of whatever election is happening, you know, why aren't we seeing everyone not being able to vote? Mm-hmm. It's just frustrating because that's not how, like I said, voting shouldn't be this hard. That shouldn't be a thing. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another thing that Maya and I were talking about a little bit that I don't think a lot of people also know, is there's this exact match rule. And Georgia is kind of known is, I guess, the most guilty of doing this. And it is basically that the names of people who are African American or Latino or Asian American tend to be more unfamiliar to election workers. So they might have names that don't match on the databases from one form to another, or election officials might actually enter the correct name incorrectly because they're confused by the spelling or they don't recognize the name. So you might have an African American come and present their ID, and the name on their ID, which is most likely, I'm gonna say 99.99% sure that the name on the ID is the correct name, and it's not matching the roster because whoever transferred that name to the document or entered that into the system misspelled it because they're unfamiliar with the spelling, or they were confused, or what have you. And now we have a person that is not able to vote.
Yeah, I feel like this is another one of those instances that we see people of color being unequally targeted in our society the way that it is right now. It's kind of like the same thing as when you have a substitute teacher in school and they can't pronounce your name, so then they just forget about it, they brush it aside. Or if there's a barista that can't pronounce your name, they just brush it aside because they don't understand. Well, it's like they have the privilege to not understand. And I just think it's ridiculous the way that these kinds of nuances of trying to just whiten culture can actually have these legitimate effects on voting and people being able to have access to choosing their government. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely unfair. Yeah, there's no way.
I think you made a really good point how we just want to whiten everything.
Right.
And it's interesting because you also made a really good point about the privilege of just letting it go or just overlooking that. You know, as a white woman, I have that privilege of just kind of not, if I feel really uncomfortable of saying a name or not really knowing how to say a name, I can just ignore it. But then we see the contradictions of a lot of other white people that if someone didn't try to say their name correctly, they'd get super upset. But people of color are just never allowed to have this space and or voice to be just learn my name.
Yeah,
it's
right.
my name. And it's just frustrating. I think that can be a piece to a very large puzzle to this overall issue. One of the things that you and I kind of talked about, and I was learning more from you at this point, is with election talk, we always talk about the Black vote or the Latino vote. And that, we don't really talk about it as the white vote.
Right.
So I would love to, talk a little bit more about that.
Definitely. With those things, the Black vote, the Latino vote, I just feel like there's an oversimplification that we have in politics where we don't bother to go more in depth and to understand the issues of a community or to understand how specifically intersectionality, how I was saying before, how Black women might be affected by politics and want to vote, or how maybe Latino men want to vote. There's just no, generally at least, there's no I'm sorry.
It's okay. Take your time.
There's no effort put forward to make a specific understanding of these communities and the intricate ways that they interact with each other. So I think that that's really a shame. The Black vote is a complex thing and the Latino vote is a complex thing, and all these other specific minorities.
So as I'm going to be real here, as a white woman, I don't understand what it means that the Black vote is complex. So I want to know more about that.
Well, I just think that Black women experience life very differently than Black men. And so there needs to be understanding in the way that their needs are different, right? So it's we see a lot of a high mortality rate in women of color during childbirth, right? That's a very unique issue. That's very specific to those types of communities. And so how can that be accurately portrayed by just saying the black vote? There's no way to capture that. We need to start talking about more individual sections of people and how politics influences them particularly.
Okay, that makes more sense. So I was like, what about voting is complex? No, that makes sense. And I feel like what you're speaking to is just this idea that it's just typically more difficult for, Black people to vote, and or, the policies that are enacted during, whoever's time, who is that representing? Who is that actually affecting at the end of the day? And that's just something I've never had to think about because I'm white. If you didn't know, just so you know, I'm white.
Yeah, she is. I'm not.
Oh, yeah. So, but I think what's important is saying I'm white and I've never had to think about these things. Acknowledging your privilege in situations is, I think, a big step in how you can help support other people that don't have a seat at the table or don't have a voice. Because in the same breath, like, you don't know what you don't know. So, like, if I don't know there's an issue, I can't actively work towards helping solve that issue.
Definitely.
But then there's the other half of that where, like, you have to want to, like, learn too. So that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's been talking about politics and talking about government stuff is not, to me, it's not the most exciting topic, partly because it's one of those things where it gets very heated very quickly.
I just feel like it doesn't have to be. That's kind of my main thing with politics, is I feel like the way that we've seen politics is people try and make it this big complex thing that's hard to understand, and they get really upset, and there's this and there's that, but in reality, politics need to be accessible to everyone because they affect everyone. Actually, they affect people that try and, like, throw their hands up and not understand it. The people that they're trying to exclude through these complex political discussions, those are the people that see policy affect them the most. So I think that it's important that we talk about politics and we talk about government, because I believe that it's something that we all need to work towards understanding so we can, see how it affects us, or at least be an ally to the people that it really affects. Because I feel like that's another thing, people that the other end of that, people that throw their hands up and don't care about politics, well, maybe you have the privilege to not care about politics.
Ooh, that's a thing.
That is a thing.
Oh, man, we touched that very lightly earlier, just kind of, but in a different way. Yeah, I mean, oh, that was so good. Having the privilege to not care about politics is, I think, a large issue. Mm-hmm. I feel like having that privilege to not care about politics is what can keep certain people and certain policies in place, because there's not enough people out there saying, don't do this, don't, like, or vote, or not voting, vetoing things, or just, protesting. Like, to have the privilege to not care about politics is wild to me. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm just thinking about that right now, and how, like, as much as I don't really like talking about politics, as a woman in general, there has been a lot of policies that that President Trump has tried to enact, and, is actively really just worked really hard to not protect women.
Right.
And so I feel, as a woman, as a general woman, I don't feel like I have the privilege to just not care about politics. Mm-hmm. But I know people in my life. I have people in my life that definitely have that sense of, that mentality of, like, I don't really feel anything.
Yeah, definitely in my life too, but it's kind of like you need to shake those people and help them understand that even if for whatever reason they're not being personally affected, that doesn't mean that there aren't people being impacted every day by the things that are talked about. Like, we just did some research into the Trump's proposed budget for 2021, and there's talk about eliminating paid leave, things like that. And I know that's a women's issue, but that's an everyone issue.
Oh yeah, that's like a parent issue. That's not even just like I think it was Finland. One of the maybe it was Finland or it was Denmark. I forget. One of them actually just changed the language of their paid leave, and they started calling it parental leave because it's the parents that have to take care of this new baby. And like, I'm getting started on on a whole other issue of like paid leave, but like those budget cuts were going to do some gnarly damage to women and to other people that know women, are connected to women. So interestingly, that article was really upsetting, and we can talk more about that actually when we get back. We're going to take a quick break. If I can speak, that'd be good. And when we get back, we're going to talk about the rest of that article, and we're going to a little bit move more towards like actual women in government and what that looks like. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR. Welcome back. You're listening to Tough Topics. I'm your host, Trisha. For anyone that is just tuning in now, we just finished up talking a little bit about voting and the history of voting, specifically that, we are going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote. But in reality, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of white women gaining the right to vote. And then that actually, that African-American women really struggled largely in that whole movement post, gaining that right. And now we're going to talk more, and we also talked about voter suppression. I would 100% encourage you to, once this is put up on Spotify, check out the first half too. It was a pretty informative little section. And now we're going to transition into talking more about women in government and women in politics and maybe the lack thereof and the lack of representation and things like that. I did some research on, how many women are actually in elective offices. So according to 2018, 110 women serve in the U.S. Congress, 23 women serve in the Senate, and 87 women in the House. The number of women in statewide elective executive posts is 74, and the proportion of women in state legislators is 25.4%. And we actually can break that down a little bit more. That sounds like a lot, and that doesn't really even give you an idea of how few women are in office because, some of that sounds big. Like when you say 110 women, what does that actually mean? Well, according to 2018, women hold 110 of the 535 seats in the 114th U.S. Congress. So when you think about it in those terms, it's only 20.6%.
Yeah. I do want to say, though, that it is record-breaking, and that's really awesome that so many women are being elected into these offices, but there is still a lot of work to be done, and there is still a lot more room that we need to make for equal representation. But I think it is really neat that we are seeing an increase of women being elected into office, and I hope that trend continues.
Yes. And before I continue, I do want to throw this out here. I feel like it's important to also note that we are coming from a democratic or liberal, lens of this. We are looking more at, we're going to talk a little bit about some women in government and specific women, and they're definitely more on the Democratic side. But I like to throw that out there because it's not that we purposely were we didn't sit down and we weren't you know what, screw Republicans. They don't deserve to be talked about. That's not necessarily what we, sat down and thought about. We just more looked at, what women do we want to talk about? And some of the women that we're going to talk about are very popular and are very well known because of, how, I guess, courageous they have been in their work and how they're not really fitting the molds anymore. But, you know, when we talk about Congress, 81 of the 110 are Democrats, and 29 of them are Republicans. There's other little facts that I wanted to throw out there. Let's see. And I just so you, anyone that is interested in looking up these statistics or interested in learning more, I found a lot of this information from Rutgers University. I think I just Googled women in office. And this is what came up. So,
Yeah.
you know, this information is not hard to find. So then going into House of Representatives, 23 of the 100 seats in the Senate and 87 of the 435 seats of House of Representatives are women. So you're, again, seeing 23 and 20% of those seats being women. Maya, I think you made a really, really great point, and it's easy to forget how exciting and how much progress we definitely have made. Actually, yes, there was something that I remember that I wanted to throw out there. This one graph that I found it shows like percentages of women in elective office by the year. So even back in, it goes all the way back to 1971, and we were seeing 3% women in the Congress and 7% statewide electives. And they have a not applicable for state legislators, so that's interesting. And then, you know, the next, in 1973, we see again 3%, and we don't really see it go above 10% until 1993, with 10.1% of U.S. Congress is women and 22% in statewide electives. So it's been a long process, but we have slowly but surely have gotten more representation within office.
Right. And I think a lot of exciting things also happened in 2018 for women in office. Like, I found that in 2018, we saw the first Native American women, Sharice Davids and Deb Holland. I hope I pronounced those names correctly. But they were elected to Congress, and I think that that's a really awesome achievement for women of color.
100%. I think over the past couple of years, we've just seen more representation ethnically, and that's super cool. Super cool. Interestingly, we should also kind of talk about why we don't see women in government. You know, what are those barriers, or maybe what are those messages that we've been told for a really long time? And one of the big things is the imposter syndrome, just not feeling like, you have the appropriate qualifications, even though you do. It's very common for women to feel that in positions of power. What else did you find about that?
I think imposter syndrome is just something that affects women in politics, but also just affects women in pretty much every space that they enter. So another field that I observe this a lot in is like women in STEM. They don't feel as secure because society is pushing on them and telling them that they don't deserve to feel secure. When in reality, I heard one time that a lot of higher up positions are filled by men because women have this imposter syndrome generally, and they don't feel like they're qualified enough to apply and go for these positions when, you know, we're just the same, if not better. So I definitely think that this imposter syndrome plagues us and keeps a lot of women from running for office. Like, I know personally for me, I'm very interested in politics. I love talking about these things. I love thinking about these things. And AOC, actually.
I'm so glad you brought her up.
Yeah. I think she has done a lot to help me be able to visualize myself in a position. She's young. She is a woman of color. And I think that that is something that a lot of people need to see right now. It's really great to see her succeeding and to see her inspiring populations of people. She's really done a lot to help her community in New York, and I think she's done a lot, at least nationally, because I know I was affected when I saw AOC, like, you know, take office, and I love following her on Twitter and seeing all the things that she's working on. She does a lot to advocate for environmental policy. She's just an all-around awesome person, and to see a person like that be able to, you know, take politics by the reins and, like, really navigate these areas where people like her and people like me and people like a lot of us don't always have a space. I just think it's incredible.
I really thought you were going to say that she took government by the balls. Oh, man, that would have been funny. Yeah, I mean, she is the youngest person to be in Congress, which is, I think, amazing. I could be remembering this kind of wrong from the little documentary that's on her about her on Netflix, that her background isn't necessarily in politics. So I think is that correct? Am I wrong?
No, you're right.
That's correct? Okay, cool. I think this is just a beautiful example where, you know, she doesn't necessarily have the background, but she stepped up to the plate and she, you know, broke through those barriers of imposter syndrome. And I'm sure maybe when there's no cameras on her or there's no recordings or, you know, at the end of the day, behind closed doors, she could be experiencing these things and we just don't know about it. But the work that she's publicly doing is just surpassing so much and is really brave. She's very well articulated in how to kind of communicate the effects that a lot of these policies have had on real people, and why these issues are important to care about, and, you know, why they need to change.
Right. I just think, like I said before in the first half of our show, that that these policies, they really impact people that may come from, like, a lower income community, and I think that AOC does a great job of reaching out to those communities and really representing them well and making politics accessible to everyone. I think that that's very important.
100%. Representation is always going to be super important. And I'm gonna take a step back. We keep saying AOC. Just in case you don't know who AOC is, we're talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is interesting that we've abbreviated her name because...
Yeah!
We just talked about how, like, we want to make everything white and we want to make it easy and we want to make it XYZ. And so it's just funny that we have abbreviated her name. I think just saying it in its full length is kind of a lot, but
She's
not because
Alexandria from now on. I'm calling her Alexandria.
Okay, we can do that, Alexandria.
Good point, Trisha. That's
I caught us in our own.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh man.
I mean, I think that's also another important thing, is just continuously keeping yourself in check. So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, representation is important. One of my professors was like, honestly, like, you need to be really critical and think about who is being represented at the table. Like, when you hear one of the candidates talking about the policies that they're interested in enacting, think about who is that benefiting? Who at the end of the day is actually going to reap those benefits? And I think if you come at it from that perspective, it changes your view on a lot of things and a lot of different politicians. I think we need to move into a direction where we don't necessarily just think about ourselves and what is benefiting us, but who else is being benefited.
Yeah.
Child support. No, not child support, but like early childhood education is a huge one that I've become a lot more familiar with. And as a woman, I've thought a lot about because of wanting to have kids and, you know, what are my options look like? We don't even have paid maternity leave.
Right.
You know, we don't even have a system set up to support pregnant mothers about to give birth.
And it keeps getting worse and worse, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, we literally were just talking about how Donald Trump's budget plan for 2020 is literally
2021.
2021 is to take more of that away. And it's like, okay, so who do you think is going to take care of these children?
Right.
Because if you're not going to put funding in place for early childhood education and daycares, so again, here we are stripping away and not protecting women.
Right. And that's another thing that I think also contributes to a lack of women representation in politics is this idea of there being a role conflict. So we have a conflict between, in society, we want to see like a strong politician. We want to see someone who's bossy and knows what to do. And I think that kind of comes into conflict a lot of the time with this idea of like female motherhood and nurturing, which to me, at least, I mean, I'm not saying that applies to every female by any means. Everyone is however they are, and I think that's beautiful. But I think that these characteristics, like emotions and motherhood, I think that those are their own form of strengths when society refuses to see that as strength. Like, we often pick apart women politicians that we do see rise up. We pick them apart and we want them to be tough and we want them to hide all their strengths so that they have a better chance of being elected, when to me, hide all their emotions to see them as more strong. But to me, that is strong, to show that you have a wholeness and that you can be, that you can be vulnerable. And I think that's something we don't allow for women in politics. So I think that role conflict is another thing that makes it really hard for women to succeed in this field unfairly.
Have you seen floating around that video of the messages that we're told as women?
No.
I'll have to show it to you after the show because it's very applicable. It's been going around on Facebook. It's literally a video, like I think it's about 1.5 to 2 minutes, and it's literally just pointing out the very, like, literal contradicting messages that we are told as women. Like you were talking about how, we are supposed to be, quote unquote, supposed to be these like nurturing, soft individuals, but then we're also told that we need to be strong and we need to be bossy and we need to stand up for ourselves and we need to lean in and we need to do X, Y, Z. But then when we do those things, then we're a bitch. Then we're something else. And it's like, we can just never be.
Right. And I also read something this morning, and, agree with it, disagree with it, but I read something this morning that said if Elizabeth Warren was a man, she would be the next president of the United States.
Let's talk about for a second, when we were at our Vagina Monologues rehearsal and we had someone helping us out that day doing a workshop with us, and she had said, our country is more ready and would be more ready to have a gay president than a woman president, and we were more ready to have a black president than a woman president. And it's just like it.
Well, we won't have a gay president now because Pete Buttigieg dropped out yesterday.
Right.
But point being.
But still, the point is our country was going to be way quicker to vote for a gay president than a woman president, and it just sends a huge message that women are nothing,
and
that we are not smart enough, and that we are not XYZ, and that we are not capable of leading a country. But and I thought about this, actually. I thought about looking this up. Hannah Gatsby had made a really, really, really good point about just how if men can't ultimately run and or lead without using violence, then how are they up for the task? Like, how are they the ones, like, always in charge? I hope I can find it. That'd be really cool.
Oh, and backpedaling a little bit, I am super ready to see more LGBTQ plus representation in politics. I think that's another thing that we could also spend a long time talking about.
Heck yeah.
Heck yeah.
Heck yeah. Again, let's ask the question, who is this benefiting? And a lot of policies do not benefit that community. And today, in 2020, we still see a lot of discrimination, still a lot of violence against that community.
Yeah.
And just super, super, super sad. And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. How did we get here? You know, like, we're in 2020 and we are still being like, gay people can't do this. Gay people can't get married. And
how is that even a question anymore?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking at our notes to see if there's other. Let's talk about lean in, because I mentioned
sure.
that.
Absolutely.
White women politicians preach that women should just lean in and work towards breaking the glass ceiling, when in reality it's just much harder for some women to get a seat at the table when everyone at the table looks white.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and trust me, I am really happy to see any women represented in politics. I think that any woman that does carve out their seat at the table, I respect that. I really, really do. But someone like me who's very interested in politics, I have a greater time imagining myself being part of that when I see someone like Alexandria do really well in her political career, as opposed to like Nancy Pelosi. You know, like her or dislike her, she has done a lot of really notable things through her political career, and I think that she is doing a really neat job of balancing that role conflict, like I talked about earlier, between she's a mother and a grandmother, and also is seen as like, you know, pretty badass politician. So I think that, like her or dislike her, she does a really neat job with that. You know, Liz Warren, Hillary Clinton, like people like that, I feel like they have an easier time getting their spot at the table because they're just a little bit closer to the people who are already there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would definitely agree with that. I think the reason why, well, before I say what I'm about to say, the lean-in idea is hard to do when you have an imposter syndrome feeling. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like, how are you supposed to lean in when you don't even feel like you deserve to be there?
Right.
And I think that the imposter syndrome just really prohibits from a lot of women being able to do any sort of work.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, this is why women don't ask for raises and ask for better paying jobs, is because they don't feel like they deserve it, because we've been told through our society that we don't deserve it and we should be XYZ, and then we go do other XYZ things, and then they're like, man, we can never win.
Right.
What I was gonna say was that I think there's always so much like controversy over like Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria, because they're quote unquote aggressive, or their actions are, you could say, controversial. Mm-hmm. And when I think I said this earlier, that like they're not doing the typical norm.
Right.
They're not doing typical politician-like things.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are seeing a lot of change happening from them.
Absolutely.
And it just makes you think, like, and kind of going back to what I said earlier about how, you know, it can, if you, seeing changes coming in one fell swoop undermines us as citizens and gives us a false idea about the way change happens. Change sometimes has to happen in a more non-traditional manner, in a way that is not typical. And yeah, people are also just afraid of change. That's a whole other thing.
Mm-hmm. Tradition.
Love tradition. So other than that, that's really all I have. I'm going to plug some events that are coming up for the Women's Center. And actually, some of them are pretty politically focused and are actually some really cool stuff. So actually tomorrow, we have on March 3rd from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., we have Beyond Pink Collar Jobs in honor of Women's History Month. This event will bring a panel of professional women to talk about their careers beyond the typical pink collar jobs, which are fields and historically considered to be women's work. Join us to hear about these professional paths and to network with them. And then on March 5th, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., we have International Women's Day. So this year's theme for International Women's Day is #EachForEqual and is drawn from the idea of collective individualism. Stop by our table to learn more about this annual event and celebrate acts of courage and determination by ordinary women in our own community. Another really interesting one is on Saturday, March 21st, from 10 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. We have an event called Elect Her. #Elect Her is a one-day nonpartisan training for women on how to run for student government and political office. The Career Center, Student Involvement, Vote Everywhere, FMLA, AWE, and the Women's Center are joining together to host this event. And then lastly, for the month, we have on March 26th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., we have Women's Empowerment Day. This is one of my favorite days. As we prepare for the upcoming 2020 election, this is a time to reflect back on the road to women gaining the right to vote, as well as the path leading forward. Join us on this 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration and Education Program.
I also wanted to invite you all, if anyone was interested, and plug our weekly Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance meetings. We meet at 11 o'clock in the morning on Tuesdays in Old Main 3, which is right across from the GLBTQ Resource Center, and we do a lot of discussion, kind of like this. We go through tons of topics that people of all genders should care about, so I'd really, really appreciate you guys coming out to our meetings. I'd really like that.
I thank you for doing that plug. That's a great opportunity for more people to learn about that. I thank you for talking to me today about all this stuff, and I'll see you next time in April, the first Monday at 1 p.m. You are listening to Tough Topics on KUR.